Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this new morning. And I'm thankful for the warmth of a home to live in and for all the things that you provide for us, the physical needs. But we are thankful most of all for the light and the spiritual needs that are provided for by you. We ask for your presence to be in our study and that you can come close to each person. We ask that you can help us with our personal struggles, our struggles with understanding your word, and our struggles in giving this message and the burden and the work that needs to be accomplished. We pray, Lord, that our studies each morning can contribute to the work that's being done upon this earth and the work that's being done in our own hearts. Be with us now as we open your word together, and guide and direct us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, good morning, everyone. We're continuing our work, of course, on the lines, and there was a suggestion that Dwight made by email yesterday in looking at the study that we need to look at each of the reform lines individually and start from the beginning. But I want to just explain how I understand it, just so that it's really clear. So back in 2010, when Jeff was doing the prophetic chain, he had this idea that these main dispensations are all connected through these reform lines. Now, he had not at that time really understood the progressive destruction of four. That wasn't until 2013 that he started presenting the number four and understanding its relationship to the reform lines, at least partly. For me, that was extremely profound in that it tied into what he had been teaching about the prophetic chains, though I don't think he really understood it at that time. In 2016, when I was at the School of the Prophets, Jeff had me present on this progressive destruction of four and my basic understanding of the prophetic chain. That is, how each reform line is preceded by this period of darkness, and that the period of darkness occurs in the fourth progressive destruction of four. Particularly, there was this debate, which I unwittingly walked into, in that I had assumed, because I hadn't studied Jeff's 4 generations of Adventism closely, I'd only known about it, and I had calculated what I considered the generations to be. And I had the 4th generation starting in 1957, and Jeff had it starting in 1989. But that didn't accord with all of the other reform lines that they had. That is, the period of darkness had always occurred in the 4th generation, and it was the time of the end that occurred in the 4th generation, not at the start of the 4th generation, that began a reform line. So Jeff had me present this, and at that time I had already developed this idea that all of these reform lines, these different dispensations, were connected. They were connected by this progressive destruction of four. So you would have a reform line, and then in the first generation after a reform line, there would be a work that was accomplished, some kind of building or construction. But then you would have a falling away that was connected with that as well. So, and that first generation would lead on to the second generation, the third, and then in the 4th generation, again, you would have a period of darkness, and then you would have a reform line begin. And the same process would continue from the creation of the world all the way to the end of time. And the major reform lines would be connected with the dispensational changes that occurred since the creation of the world. And those dispensational changes have to do with the changes in worship, the worship at the gate of Eden, the worship that changed with Noah. So there's a dispensational change that occurs with Noah. There's a dispensational change that occurs with Abraham, and in that history. And we would have to decide exactly how those dispensational changes occur. What are the differences? And then you would have, of course, when they make the sanctuary, the earthly sanctuary, the tabernacle, and then of course the building of Solomon's temple, and then we have again the destruction of that temple, and then the rebuilding of the second temple, and then of course Christ beginning his work in the holy place, and then Christ moving to the most holy place in Millerite history, and then finally his closing of the work in our history at the end of time. So those would be the main dispensations, at least that I can think of here on the spot. So those changes are all major reform lines. But within each reform line, there are waymarks, and those waymarks, all in and of themselves, can be reform lines. And I would say that the dispensational changes that occur are actually the waymarks within the great controversy reform line. And so what we have seen as major reform lines are just waymarks within a bigger reform line. And so this is the idea of a fractal. That is, when you zoom in, you see a reform line. You see what you see in the big picture, you just see it identical, or at least usually similar or self-similar. And so we've had problems. One of the problems that we've had is, as we've zoomed into waymarks and we see a reform line, we sometimes get confused about which reform line we're looking at. So this is the major problem that we're facing. And it's a problem that we can see quite clearly with something like October 13th, 2018 being considered the Midnight Cry, and then Raphia and Panium being midnight and the Midnight Cry. And we already have a Raphia on January 6th, but is that the Raphia? Is that the midnight on the big line? And the Sunday law is also considered the midnight waymark. So we see this also in Millerite history, and we see this in the reform line of Christ. That is, there's the reform line of John the Baptist, and then the reform line of Christ, and the reform line of the disciples. And they're not all the same, and yet they share some of the same characteristics. So the basic idea is, where do we move from a major reform line or a reform line within a reform line? And so this idea was not well developed in the movement. That wasn't clear where we were, especially in our own reform line.
What is this one?
So does that seem like a good summary of the problem that we've recognized? Anybody have any comments on that?
I think it provides a good beginning.
Okay. So that's where we're at as far as trying to, to approach this problem. Now, what you see, of course, on the screen is Genesis chapter 1. Now, we did go through this in our study of the sanctuary. That is, we went through this reform line, at least the best we could. And I made the case that the creation of the world is the reform line that we would mark, that starts with the time of the end, but we called it the time of the beginning. But if we're going to look in the great controversy, we would have to see that this is the waymark, the first waymark, the time of the end waymark for the great controversy reform line that spans the history of this world. And does that make sense to people? Anybody with thoughts on that? Now, I would also say that one of the things that I brought out that I made as a suggestion is that when you look at a major waymark in a reform line, so let's say we take the reform line of the great controversy reform line. Well, the first waymark has a reform line in it. So since this is the time of the end, or the time of the beginning in this case, we would see that the reform line that occurs in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, that reform line is going to speak more about the time of the end. That is, it's going to be weighted or focused upon that first waymark. That is, it's going to carry more characteristics from that waymark than it would from all the other waymarks. Do people understand what I'm saying by that? What?
I'm wondering if you could repeat that or rephrase that, please.
Okay, so let's say we take a waymark. Let's say we take the reform line of the Great Controversy, and we find that there is a waymark that we would call midnight. We would expect in that reform line that is marked at midnight, because you're going to have a major reform line, that the characteristics of that reform line that occurs in that waymark is going to speak more to that waymark. That is, that reform line is going to be addressing that waymark in more detail than the other waymarks. So even though all the waymarks contain all the characteristics of the entire reform line, that each of them are going to speak to a particular point. Now, the idea that I have, and I have not thought enough about it to have it comprehensive, but we have this whole entire reform line. And what we have is we have the darkness at the beginning. And a reform line addresses the particular characteristics of the darkness by a response to an increase of light that really covers the entire reform line. And so we would have to think that when it comes to the Great Controversy reform line, that entire reform line is going to be addressing the rebellion that happened in heaven at the beginning. And we can see that by when we get to the end of it, it's obviously going to be addressing that. The close of probation with the sins of God's people that had been forgiven being confessed upon the head of the scapegoat, and him then bearing his responsibility. So we can see that obviously the end of the reform line is going to address the beginning. That's the Alpha and the Omega principle. But we would see then within all of the different major reform lines, issues of the Great Controversy being expressed. That is, since the Great Controversy reform line has all these different aspects to it, that God is giving this progressive increase of light since the fall of Lucifer, then that means we would recognize that not every reform line addresses every truth. Even though it has the same structure, it's progressive. And so God, through history, has been undoing the work that Satan had begun in heaven, that work of rebellion, and God is seeking to undo that. And this becomes quite enlightening when we start to look back at the various waymarks, when we can decide in the history of the Great Controversy which part of that is the first angel's message, or which part is the second angel's message. We can start to see why certain things happen in a certain way, and why God has revealed his light to humanity in this progressive manner. We can also see why we have this falling away that happens after each reform line, that eventually in the fourth generation, or the fourth progressive destruction of four, creates this period of darkness, which has a particular characteristic that then is addressed by a reform line. So all from the beginning of the creation of the world to the new creation of that new heaven and a new earth, we can see that there has been this unfolding of light to mankind that had to happen in a progressive way, just like it does in any reform line, whether it's a personal reform line, and for me personally, when I first came to God, I was 17. It was on August 11th, 1980. And I had tried to be a Christian for a lot of years, but I remember when I gave my life over to God and asked him to take control of my life, that the illustration that struck me from the Bible was that men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And I understood that the light of God's truth had been shining upon me, and I had resisted that light because I didn't want to have my deeds exposed. And in going to God, I was asking him to address the sin problem in my life, and that I was accepting the light that I could bear at that time. God didn't show me everything. And we can see this then is a reform line. We all have this personal reform line where we're in darkness and light comes and we accept that light. But that's not the end of our reform line. And we saw that we can take a reform line and we can take that personal reform line, such as we see in Steps to Christ, and we can see that those are the steps of the sanctuary themselves. That is, the sanctuary gives us this symbol of a reform line. And in the study that we did on the sanctuary from Eden lost to Eden restored, we finished up with the book of Revelation. Well, we haven't quite finished yet. We have one more study. But in the book of Revelation, we can see that there is this, it goes back to the beginning of Genesis, and it takes all the symbols of the sanctuary as well, and shows this progression of God's work in the book of Revelation, dealing from the time of Christ onward, right? So it's not really, even though it goes back and uses imagery from the beginning, all of its time prophecies are going to begin from the first century. Is that helpful, that sort of summary? Does that make things more clear? You know, I wanted to write these things out a long time ago, but every time I began, new things arose and new insights. But I think we're at the point where we can begin this process. And what I'm going to try to do as we go through these studies, which takes a bit of time, is really to write this out. So the summary that I kind of gave there, I'm going to use that a little bit and try to give this overview of these lines and then start putting them together from the beginning. So let's just go together through Genesis chapter 1. So can we agree that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth? The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Can we agree that this is the time of the end, and this is the first angel's message?
It looks to be a symbol of that, yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is the law of first mention, and we see darkness and we see light. And there's going to be this increase of light and this empowerment of it. So, you know, we're going to have, if we go on and read, it says, "And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness." So what is the dividing of the light from the darkness? What does that have to do with the first angel's message?
I'm sorry, a separation?
So it's a separation. So and so this is the beginning of a separation. And we what do we say that a uh, the everlasting gospel is? What does it do?
Separates two classes of worshipers.
Right. Yeah. So it prepares and demonstrates two classes of worshipers. So there's a work of separation that goes on. That is, when you have light, there's going to be a response to that light. And we know that men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. So when God gives light, there's going to be a response. Now, this, of course, is symbolic in the creation of the world. Now, and the darkness itself, now, this is talking about literal darkness, but what is this darkness? We know we have this word that's abyss. So the darkness was upon the face of the deep, the panim, right? The face of the deep. Now, the word face, it's a Hebrew, when they use the word face, it can mean presence, right? It's the same, and it's the word face, like a human face, but when the face of God or the presence of God. So you have this darkness upon the face of the abyss. So what is this darkness?
Non-understanding?
Well, it would be not just not understanding, it would be misunderstanding, or really, if we're going to talk about darkness, it's lies, right?
Agree.
It's error, in contrast to light, which is truth.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to say, but reading you is different.
Yeah. So when we think about this has to be the darkness that has come about because of Satan's rebellion. And Ellen White makes this clear about the creation of the world, that this is in a response to Satan's rebellion. I got it here. Anyway.
Theodore, just to
Yeah.
ask a question here.
Yeah.
So it may be totally off topic, but darkness in outer space, has there not always been darkness?
No, there hasn't always been darkness. So, and actually space isn't, it may be dark in a certain sense, but it's actually completely full. Space is not empty, but it's empty from things that are visible. But it doesn't mean that it's empty.
Okay.
Yeah. Space is full of energy.
I agree.
Yeah, I think like the amount of, I used to know the amount of energy that is in 1 cubic centimeter of space, of empty space. And it's a huge amount of energy, more energy than our sun produces in its lifetime. So
I agree.
Yeah, so it's just, we just think of space as empty, but it's not.
It is not.
Yeah, so, but I don't think this is talking about space, because when God creates the heaven and the earth, he is creating what we would call space. Bible verses that talk about this. Such a bad typer. So Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 44. So Isaiah 40:22, he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. So it talks about this stretching out of the heavens, and there's other verses too. Zechariah talks about stretches forth the heavens, and this stretching is something that we see, that space is expanding. And I'm a little bit of a scientist. I've been a physics geek since I was a child, so I don't want to go into too much physics, but basically everything in the universe is expanding at an accelerated rate. And that rate that it's expanding is what causes the gravity that we experience on Earth. So everything is expanding, every particle. And so it's very hard to understand. It's hard to conceptualize. But that's what I understand. So, and when God spoke the world into creation, at creation, spoke it into existence. There's tons of verses that talks about him stretching out the earth. So somebody's got music playing there in the background.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's my.
Okay, so it's nice music describing creation, maybe. But God stretches out the heavens. And so we see this expansion of space. Scientists know about it, but they don't know the cause of it. And they try to say it's the Big Bang. But this is actually the Word of God creating this universe. So does that kind of help answer that question?
Yes, that does give some light.
Okay. Now, when you read Genesis, and it says, in the beginning, God created in the heaven and the earth, one of the things that most Christians think is that everything was created when the earth was created. But as Seventh-day Adventists, we know that God created other things before he created this earth. What exactly the heaven is that he created and the earth that he's created is not necessarily clear. That is, this is not talking about the entire universe that's being created. But so we don't know, and I don't like to speculate exactly on what's happening. But this is sort of a title. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it tells us about the creation of the earth. And of course, the sky. And talks about the firmament of the heavens. So trying to understand this in sort of scientific terms, the Bible isn't using scientific terms. And so we don't necessarily know exactly what it means, but what we can know is what it means on a prophetic level. So we know that there is darkness, and that darkness existed because of rebellion in heaven. Prior to that, there was no darkness. And to try to imagine what existed before the earth existed is sort of a futile. We don't know. We don't know exactly what this means. And so again, I don't like to speculate about things. All I know is that this darkness is the darkness of error, and that this light is in response to that, at least on a prophetic level.
Well, Ellen White, you did say that other worlds existed.
Yeah, other worlds existed, but exactly what that means, I've tried to speculate on this, and I kind of always feel foolish when I do, because I don't know, right? It could be, so let's just look at a speculation. It could be the God who created all the universe, and that's included in some ways with the creation of the heaven. But now we're dealing with the creation of the earth. So this is one option. I'm not saying it's correct. And that the earth existed and that Satan's going to be cast down to the earth when there's this rebellion in heaven. And then God's going to form this earth into what we see in this process of creation. And at that time, he's going to make the sun and the moon, which are that don't exist when earth first exists as this empty rock or whatever it is, right? So we don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, I think I did have done a study
Yeah.
on this here, and to me, God is planning to create this earth and to create man, and then that makes Satan jealous and so forth. So and then the rebellion in heaven happens, and Lucifer and his angels are cast out of heaven, and then God creates the earth in 6
Right.
days.
Yeah.
So I don't believe that the earth existed prior to the rebellion of Satan. I don't think Satan was cast down onto the earth and then God created, that there was some earth it was just there, and then Satan was cast
Right.
out.
That's what I'm saying. So we don't know. I mean, it's kind of unclear. But we do know that the rebellion in heaven happens before Genesis 1 verse 2. Right?
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, even before verse 1.
Well, except that verse 1 is just kind of a summary. When God created the heaven and the earth, that could be dealing with everything of creation. It could be. Right? That's all I'm saying. But
Yes, I think the thing that threw a question mark in might have been the comment of them being thrown out and the earth maybe being a rock. So that comment gave form to something
yeah,
that was without form.
yeah, well, yes, I know. That's what I'm saying. Is it's just like I'm saying, I don't know what it was that's not formed. I mean, maybe it's molten or something. I have no idea. That's what I'm saying is anything that we would try to fill in these spaces would be speculation.
Right, because we would never know for certain.
Right. So all I do know is that rebellion happened in heaven prior to the earth being created. Exactly how, I mean, it could be that 1 verse 1 is after the rebellion is in heaven and God is now talking about the creation of the heaven and the earth, referring to the earth's heaven and earth, right? So I just don't know. What I am saying, though, is that there is a creation that exists before the earth is created, and there is a rebellion that occurs before the earth is created.
Yes.
That we can know from the spirit of prophecy. And so that this is a reform line in response to that darkness that exists, that rebellion that exists. Whether God is already planning to create the earth or not, whether that's, I mean, I know that Satan's rebellion, the seeds of his rebellion existed before God even discusses the creation of the earth. But the rebellion itself happens, my understanding from the spirit of prophecy and from what Stephen is saying, is that when it's sort of announced that God's going to create the earth, then the actual rebellion occurs. Before that, it's just subterfuge, right?
Mm.
So Satan has been planting the seeds of rebellion. God announces that he's going to create the earth. And this is meant as God's response to this, these seeds of rebellion that exist. But in Satan, instead of causing him to worship God, he's going to then respond with this rebellion and take 1/3 of the angels with him. Now, we know they're cast down to the earth. What's that, Stephen?
Yeah, I don't see it quite that way. I would say that it's through God having counsel with Jesus, and to make the earth and to create man. But then that sort of initiates
Mhm. Yeah, 'cause
Satan
yeah,
becoming jealous.
Yeah, you're correct. You're correct. There's something going on between the Father and the Son that is creating jealousy. But the thing is, it already exists before, right? That dissatisfaction has already existed before. You would agree with that?
I don't.
Yes.
Okay, Ron agrees.
I don't agree. No.
You don't agree. So you think it's when he says that, okay, because I read that different in the spirit of prophecy. So if you can gather together the statements and present them, that would be helpful. Because in my reading of it, that I take it that the seeds have already begun, and that the offer for the creation of the earth or whatever happens in connection there. But maybe maybe we're both not seeing it 100% correctly. I don't know. But if we're going to simplify it to some point, we know that the creation of the earth occurs after rebellion. That we can agree on, right?
Well,
Yes.
Okay. And so that's why when it says, in the beginning, I'm going to take that as the time of the end. And then you have this first angel's message, this response. And I would go through and say that finally the empowerment of that message occurs when because you're going to have, so there's a whole bunch of things that happen, and maybe we should go back a little bit or ahead a little bit, because we have these dividings that occur. You have the dividing of the light from the darkness. God calls the light day, which is Yom, and the darkness he calls night, which is Lila. And then there is evening, that's Erev, that's sunset, and Boker, morning, and that's the first day. So this is the first day of creation. So we would say that this is the arrival of the first angel's message. Would we say that?
That can fit.
Okay. And then we're going to have this. So if we look at the arrival of the first angel's message in any history, it's an increase of light. It begins an increase of light. That light, of course, continues all the time because there's still darkness. But that light increases under the first angel's message. And then you're going to have the second day. So the second day is God says, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, there's lots of disagreement about what this actually means. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So the question is, what is this talking about? Just first, in a literal sense, how would we understand what happens on the second day?
separating the sky from the earth itself.
Okay, so when we look at the firmament that are
Under?
there's a firmament in the midst of the waters, and we're dividing the waters from the waters. So this would be the waters in the sky and the waters on the earth.
Yes, that's the way I take it.
Okay, anyone else with any insight into this of what this means?
It sounds like it's definitely dividing the waters.
Yeah, it's definitely dividing the waters. And now the waters there, the word mayim usually just means, I mean, it's related to the word sea, because the word sea is kind of just the word waters. But it can have lots of different meanings. But the idea here is that somehow there's these waters, and some of these waters are in the heaven, because the firmament is heaven or the sky, right? So we're not going to think of this as, even though this word here is shamayim, which is the same word that we have for the heavens and the earth at the beginning there. Shemayim means heaven. And that word, the Hebrew word, it means the sky, but it can also mean anything in the celestial bodies or anything in heaven. So it just means lofty or lifted up, right? So the stuff that's above, it's called Shemayim, lofty, lifted up. It's the heaven. But then we have the waters that are on the earth. So they're under the firmament and they're divided. So that's the second day. So what is this? What is the waters in a reform line? What is the symbol that's here? And if we're saying this is an empowerment of, or not empowerment, a formalization, or is this a formalization of the first angel's message? Or what happens in a waymark that this dividing of the waters from the waters is happening? Why is this happening? Because we already had the day and the night divided, and the light and darkness divided. So now we have the waters divided.
Symbol for waters. Symbol for waters. What is it?
Well, there's lots of symbols. I mean, it can refer to peoples, but I don't think it
Yes.
does here. At
Not
least I
here.
don't think it does, but maybe it does.
It's symbolic to us at this point, right?
Okay. Yeah, well, we're looking at it symbolically, but the question is, what does it symbolize? Does it symbolize peoples in other reform lines? The people are divided.
I think so, and this is just the beginning of it.
Okay.
I would somewhat think it was people because of the use of seas by the Hebrew.
Yeah.
So
Well,
then
it's related to the word seas. Yeah.
can angels also be classified in the same way as people?
They're just a little higher, right?
Yeah, I don't think that this is dealing with angels though.
Yeah.
But
So I was just trying to fit in the symbolic meaning of a being, of humans.
yeah,
Yeah. No, this is going, yeah.
okay. All we know is that there's all this dividing that keeps going on in this first part, right? So on the first day you have this dividing, on the second day you have this dividing, and then on the third day, and God said, "Let waters under the heaven be gathered together." So you're going to have a gathering together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called the seas. He called seas, which is, this is the word yam. So this is a different word. They're related to each other, but they're not the same as waters. And God saw that it was good, right? So, and then this is still going to be the same day. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there were morning, the third day. So you're going to have these first 3 days. First, you have the creation of the light and its separation. Then you have the separation of the waters. And then you have the separation of the waters from the earth. And on the earth, you're going to have all of these plants grow. So what would the symbols be? How would we understand this in relation to the first angel's message?
I see 3 events happening. And then on the 4th day, it looks like that's when he brought light.
On the third day.
Yes. No, well, on the third day, yeah,
Third day, he creates the grass, this and all that, and the plants.
then he,
Trees.
let's see. Fourth, I can't move that thing. Let me look at mine.
Oh, you're trying to move my computer?
Yeah.
Anybody with thoughts on this?
We have the idea of the seed being brought forth, yielding after its own kind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Seems to me that's a new entry into this situation.
Well, one of the things, when we talk about the first angel's message, the foundation is laid in the first angel's message. Is this the foundation of the earth?
Yes.
I would have to say yes.
Yeah, so this is the laying of the foundation of the earth, however we want to understand it. Now, we have a lot of symbols here. And of course, you're going to have a lot dealing with the law of first mention of what these things could represent. So, I'm not trying to put too much of my understanding on this. I really want to look at this kind of fresh again, because I had a way in which I understood this, and it may be correct, but it may not be. But we've gone through 3 days, and the thing about it is, when we deal with the waymarks, we would normally have arrival of the first angel's message, the formalization, and then the empowerment of it, and then the arrival of the second angel, its formalization, and then its empowerment, and then the arrival of the third. Now, the nice way to do this would be that each of these days represents one of those waymarks. But I'm not saying that that's how it should be. Now, always when I looked at the fourth day, so let's just look ahead a bit and then we can go back. It says, let's move too high. And God said that let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let it be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Now, I like to say that this is the empowerment of the first angel's message. And why is that?
Got the element of time in it.
It's the element of time. And why is that then the empowerment of the first angel's message? In Millerite history, we have August 11th, 1840. Is that the
Yeah.
empowerment of time?
Well, it's the end of a time prophecy.
Well, yeah, but it's the empowerment of time. Specifically, when we looked at Josiah Litch's prophecy, we saw that 391 years is a very precise measurement of time. That is, it goes down to the hour, in that it's this division of time that we could divide into 12, right? It's like you can divide a day into 12 hours. You can divide 391 years into 12 periods of 391 months of our months, or you could take it even as 12 periods of 403 synodic months, right? So lunar months. and then it's going to be precise to the point that it's going to be 11,900 days and 1,190 hours. So we have this really precise number of 11.9 in its space of time, and that you multiply by 12 to get the entire period of the 391 years, which is precise to within the hour of solar years compared to the lunar years, right? So compared to the biblical count of 391 years and the solar count of 391 years. So it's a naturally occurring cycle that's based upon the sun and the moon in their relationship, and they're given for signs, for seasons, for days and years. And so in the first angel's message in Millerite history, it's empowered by this time prophecy that's really tied to Genesis 1 verse 14, at least in my thinking. So somehow we would have to look at this as the empowerment of the first angel's message. Right, and of course it's going to talk about the creation of the sun and the moon, and then also the planets, right?
It's like starting the clock.
Yeah, well, in a sense, I mean, starting the clock prophetically. I mean, we know that the days have already existed, whatever they mean, however they're keeping track of those. I mean, it could be just going back, using the day that's created by the sun and the moon and just looking back in time. I don't know, but how they're keeping track of the days, the evening and the morning prior to the creation of the sun, I don't know. But I would just think it's the same period of time that we would have once the sun and the moon and the stars are created, the planets are created.
Well, we have to remember that God's ways, not our ways. You know, for him, it's a day is 1,000 years.
Yeah, but these are not.
I understand that.
Days.
I understand that.
Yeah, because you got
But
plants created, and they definitely need the sun in order to grow. So it's going to be a day. So I take these days as literal days.
Yes.
Just because the sun and moon haven't been created yet, evening and morning still exist. God knows that he's going to create the sun and the moon. So do people agree that there's a lot of convincing evidence that the creation of the sun and the moon and the planets is connected to the empowerment of the first angel's message, let there be light?
It sounds like it. It's
Yeah.
logical.
Yeah, and that it lines up with Millerite history with the empowerment of the first angel's message. So the question is, what do these other divisions mean? And I think what we could do is we could say that what this first angel's message is about light and darkness dividing. But it also relates to other things that are dividing. That is the waters and the land and the seas. So the question is why? Why is there this division symbolism that occurs under the first angel's message? And remember, think about this. So think about this again. Remember, do we get the division of the earth and the sea in Revelation? Think about the book of Revelation. Do we have this symbolism used in Revelation?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So remember, in Revelation chapter 10, you see, Christ standing with his feet, one's on the land, one's on the sea. So in Revelation chapter 10, so he has one I saw the angel, and the angel which I saw stand upon the sea. So there's one angel standing on the sea and one on the earth. Here, it's terrible with all these Greek numbers in there. So you see this in his hand. He has a little book open, right? And then it says, yeah. So the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven. But it must say that earlier. Oh yeah, verse 2. And he had in his hand a little book open. He set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot upon the earth. Right. So we see the sea and earth division here. And the sea and earth division is connected to what? In Revelation 10:2 and the rest of it. How can we connect this sea and earth in Genesis chapter 1 and its separation with this proclamation of Christ with one foot upon the sea, his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, with the book of Daniel open in his hand? Is it a proclamation of a message?
If I'm not mistaken, yes.
Okay, because he's going to cry with a loud voice as when a lion roareth, and when he cried, seven thunders uttered their voices. Right? Now, we know that this is going to be Millerite history later. So, I mean, we can say Revelation 10 is Millerite history. And when he stands with his one foot on the sea and one foot on the land, a little book open, is that under the first angel's message? Is the book of Daniel opened under the first angel's message?
I believe so.
And when he cries with a loud voice, is that under the second angel's message?
I believe you're correct.
And anybody else with that? Would we take this crying with a loud voice as the midnight cry?
Yes, I think so.
I would think that we would have to take it that way. I'm pretty sure that's how Ellen White looks at it, from what I remember that I've read. So when we go back to Genesis chapter 1, and we look at this dividing that's happening, this dividing that's happening is in response to the light being proclaimed, that this first angel's message. And it's going to divide heaven and earth, sea and earth, right? So, you know, from heaven to earth, and then the sea itself is going to be separated. And then there is these plants that grow. And so what do these plants then represent? Could we say this is the formalization of the message? And if so, why would we say that?
I would say it's a response from the light.
Okay, so it's a response from the light, but why would it be a formalization of the message? Because what's the message? What's the darkness? What is this responding to? What is God illustrating?
Would that be new birth?
Be what?
New birth.
New birth,
Plants-
so life.
Yeah.
So we know that life comes from God. God created everything. So he created the angels. Now, I mean, they came into existence at one time. How that happened, whether that was all at once or whether it was gradual, whether they've actually saw the act of creation or they just came into being all at the same time. The Bible doesn't tell us that. But now they're going to see this creative act in response to God saying, "Let there be light." And one of the created acts is new life. Now it's plant life, it's not animal life yet. But God is demonstrating something. He's just demonstrating that he is the creator and that he's the source of all life. It's not something Satan can do. He can't create life.
Only false imitations.
Now, with that, you said something I didn't catch what you said, Ron.
I got a dog. Hang on.
Okay. Yeah, so what we have here is we have this illustration, and if we think of it as a reform line, we need to somehow understand that. Now, we know that we've used Millerite history as our template, so that's what we're referring to, and we can see how it gives us light on the creation of the world as a reform line. That is, if we were just looking at this, we might not be looking for a formalization and for an empowerment of God saying, "Let there be light." But when God speaks things into existence, he's now laying the foundation of the earth, the foundation of that message. And it's going to be empowered, right? So God saying, "Let there be light," I mean, he needs the sun and the moon and these planets. He needs this earth. He needs all of these things for that first angel's message to be complete and then empowered. And remember, you can't have a second without a first, because you can't have a third without a first and a second. And then we have to look at what the second one is. But I don't know if everybody's really satisfied with what we're looking at here, because there's a lot of detail. But we can see there's a division. So with the first message, there's going to be a division. Now, the other thing is we have the work of the enemies. Now, I don't think I see the work of the enemies, though, in this first angel's message. That is, the symbols for the enemies actually come with the creation of all of these different animals, especially when it talks about the creeping things and all these animals. Now, remember when we studied this, we looked at this to some degree when we were looking at Ezekiel, because we were looking at the zodiac, the sky. And what is it that the Babylonians did with the stars in the heavens? What did they do with them? What do we have in the sky? When you look at the sky, what do you see at nighttime?
Would it be prophecy?
Okay, well, type of prophecy, that is, they created the zodiac, and with the zodiac, they tried to use this to predict events. But in doing so, they were actually trying to control their own destiny. That is, they weren't dependent upon God. So they believed, and I don't believe that they actually literally believed it. I mean, I believe it was, they understood that they were using this symbolically. I don't think that they were that basic in their understanding that they actually thought that the constellations themselves were gods. A lot of people are critical of the Bible, and atheists and people like that. They'll just talk about how they thought that the sun rose in the morning and during the night it was in the underworld, and And I don't believe that they thought that literally. I think they understood it was a symbol. People understood symbols in the past and they used symbols. But anyway, they worshiped the sun and the moon and the stars. That is, they believed that there was a connection between what they saw in the sky and what was happening on earth. And that is actually true, except that they believed that they could control that, and that if they worshiped their gods, if they observed all of these various rituals, they could control what was happening. And that was a perversion of true worship which God had given to man. So they worshiped the created things rather than the creator himself. So in the creation that we see on the fifth day, you're going to see first, he's going to create in the waters, he's going to create all the living creatures in the waters, all the sea creatures, and also all the fowl, all the birds. Right? That's that's on the fourth day, and so that's the fifth day, and then on the sixth day he's going to create the land animals, and so you're going to see in this creation of the animals, you see all of the things that end up becoming worshipped, and also become represented in the constellations. So the constellations mostly is animals. It is some people. You know, you got the twins, and you got Aquarius, and you got Virgo, things like that. But most of it's kind of animals, or even mythical animals. So how do we understand this then? How do we understand that if we're going to take that this is the second angel's message? When we say Babylon is fallen is the second angel's message, can that be related to the creation of these animals?
Daniel, I'm sorry, Nebuchadnezzar seen things as the idol. Daniel seen things as beasts. Is there a connection there?
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Well, beasts can represent nations, but
Exactly.
it is Babylon that worships the sun and the moon and the stars. So one thing that we could say here is, because I said that, it's the empowerment of the first angel's message. But can we see that even the creation of the sun and the moon and stars can be connected to the second angel's message? And that this creation of these different creatures is connected to what we would call the formalization and empowerment. The creation of the man would be the empowerment of the second angel's message. But can we see here that in Genesis chapter 1, that the first and second angel's messages are combined? The empowerment of the first angel is also the arrival of the second.
I can't see that, Theodore, because
Okay.
when it says that he's created everything, it says that it was good.
Oh, okay.
It was good. So to take that and then say something is fallen, we do know that people begin worshiping after that.
You're right.
But right here in Genesis, it is good and it's created by God and there's no fallen in it.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up, because I should have brought up that point. When we look at the creation, this is before the fall of man. And what's being set up here is a pattern or type of something that's going to happen. That is, I'm not saying, because in this reform line here, sure, we have Satan has fallen in heaven, but this isn't the time of the end. This is the time of the beginning. And in everything that's done here, this is God's creative response. That is this whole Genesis chapter 1 is all the first angel's message arriving on the reform line of the great controversy. And so this is God's increase of light response. And what we're doing is we're looking at this and seeing that there are the symbols that are going to show up later in other reform lines. So you're exactly right, Janice. This is not, Babylon does not fall here, but we can see that the symbol of Babylon, what Babylon is connected to, is the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars and of nature through idols. So these animals become idols, but they're not idols here. Does that make sense, Janice?
I can see that.
Okay.
He's referring to the originals and not the copy.
Yeah, this is not the perversion of nature yet. Man hasn't even been created. So God is going to create everything good. And we can see that he does this in response to the fact that Satan has brought in this rebellion. So now God's going to give this perfect creation, and he's going to place Adam and Eve in the garden. And this is now going to be the testing ground. This is going to be the demonstration that God is just. This whole world and all of its history is in a response to Satan's supposition, to his suggestion, to his insinuation that God is unjust. And so we can look at Genesis chapter 1 and see that it's this template of a reform line, but it in and of itself is not corrupted. Anybody else, or Janice even, responds to that? Because what I was suggesting yesterday is that this is the first waymark in the great controversy reform line that goes from Eden lost to Eden restored. So it's going to go from that history. Basically from heaven, I guess, lost to heaven restored too.
Should we try putting these things on a line?
Yep, we're going to.
I mean, because I remember Jeff's, he had the original and then it got modified and then it got modified again.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we already have drawn these on a line. Okay. The Romans chapter 1, that's talking about the perversion of these things that were created. So maybe we should go there. And this is one of my favorite passages of scripture is this section. One of the things that's interesting is Paul quotes Habakkuk chapter 2 here and other places in the book of Hebrews. The just shall live by faith. That's Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. And he's talking about the gospel of Christ. So this is interesting. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. I'm not ashamed of the everlasting gospel. Right? And we know that the everlasting gospel is a three-step testing prophetic message that prepares and demonstrates two classes of worshipers. And the focus, of God's work is primarily on restoring the image of God in man. That's, and for us, for mankind, that's what we see. But we know it's also restoring his universe. Now it says in verse 18, so you can see the righteousness of God, the gospel, but you can also see the wrath of God. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things from him, of him, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So we can see why God created the world, so that there would be no excuse for sin. He's going to demonstrate, not just by his creative power, but by his recreative power, by recreating the image of Christ, the image of God in man. He then demonstrates to the entire universe that God is just. Can we see that?
Amen.
Yeah. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Now we can see when we talk about their imaginations, what I always think about is Ezekiel chapter 8. So in Ezekiel chapter 8, you're going to have these four abominations. And the one that, where it talks about what they do in the dark. Where is it here? So he digs a hole in the wall, and then there's a door, and he said unto me, go in. So he goes into this door, and behold the wicked abominations that they do here. So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things and abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about. And there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. And in the midst of them stood Jaazaniah the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. And then he said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chambers of his imagery. This is referring to the imagination, because what he's seeing is not literal. He's in vision, and he sees portrayed in the temple this symbol. Somebody's trying to. Anyway, and so when it talks about the chambers of his imagery, it's talking about his imagination. But I also picture here sort of a. We used to have a thing called the planetarium in Edmonton. I think the building might still exist, but you could go to the planetarium and they could display the sky and the constellations and so forth, kind of like my Stellarium does on my computer, but you could see it as if you were outside at night. But really, this is what I see. It's kind of, what's that?
Griffith Observatory had the same thing.
Yeah. So, so what this would be to me is kind of like their gods, the sky being displayed, and they're worshiping these things. And so we can see Babylonian worship is about the worship of the sky, of the constellations, of astrology, and that Ezekiel, his book is written in response to that, because Israel is following the way of Babylon. And they're doing so while they're in Babylonian captivity, which would make sense. So they're not just in Babylonian captivity in that sense, they're also worshiping Babylon. Now, this is, of course, before the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. So some Jews are in Babylonian captivity and some are still in Jerusalem. And when we studied Ezekiel, we learned about that the ones who were in Jerusalem felt that they were safe, and that the ones who had gone into captivity, especially northern Israel, but even other Jews who had gone, that they were, in a sense, lost, but they were safe. But the reality is they're corrupt. They're in Babylon in their hearts. And that's why God has to destroy Jerusalem. And he's going to use Babylon to do it. So we can see then that what ends up being worked out in history is being portrayed prophetically with the creation of the world in this reform line. And it's really showing God's plan in the restoration of
So
everything. Yeah, Janice?
Theodore, back to Ezekiel there.
Okay.
When you were talking about them, could you put it up again, please?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so he's in vision,
Yeah.
but were you also saying that at that point, what he is seeing is the sky?
Okay, so what he sees is, because this is in vision, so he goes and he digs a hole in the wall of the temple and he goes in to this particular room, which is on the gate. So it's not in the sanctuary itself, but it's in this in the north wall of the sanctuary courtyard. So there's a
Okay.
particular room that he goes into, digs a hole, and he sees them there in this room with all of these gods portrayed upon the walls and everywhere, the ceiling. So he's seeing this false worship. Now, it doesn't actually occur. That is, he's actually back in Babylon.
Right.
So it's a vision that he has, but he's showing what's going on spiritually with the Jews in Jerusalem, that they really, even though they think that God doesn't see what goes on in their hearts, that their hearts are full of sin, of false worship. And that's why Jerusalem is going to be destroyed.
But somehow, I don't know if my train of thought leapt there, but could you scroll it up just a little bit more? But I thought somehow that became star worship.
Yes, because these
Or
abominable,
constellation
yeah.
worship.
So all of these creeping things, these are the constellations, right? So what they're worshiping, what Babylonian worship was the worship of the heavens. That is, the sun, moon, and stars, the planets, right? So you got, and we know that that's why our week is named as it is, because each of the days of the week have one of the objects that moves through the constellations as a god. So you have the constellations themselves, which are kind of gods, but the ones that are moving, that is the planets and the sun and the moon, of which altogether that they would have seen would be 7 of them. There would be 5 planets that they observed moving through the constellations, and the sun and the moon moving through the constellations. And that is the false worship. It's astrology. And that's what the Jews were involved in. And that's what Babylon was involved in.
So you're taking the creeping things as the movement of the constellations. I always thought that was more literal, that it was even
Idols?
down to the real creeping things, like the bugs or frogs or whatever they might be.
Yeah,
and
creeping
then-
things refers to anything that walks on the earth.
Okay.
It just means something that moves, right? That doesn't necessarily mean spiders, things like that.
So, but I'm not seeing how we went from that to just limited to constellations. Am I?
Because what I'm saying is that Babylon, that's what they worshipped, was the sky. They made idols as well, but those idols were representing what they saw in the sky. Right? So the worship of the Babylonians is the worship of, it's astrology. That is what their worship was about.
Okay, I guess I would have to know more about what they're,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
Yeah,
in the book
because-
of what's that?
well, because I haven't read that or heard that before. I don't know.
Okay. Well, remember in the book of Daniel,
Yeah,
it talks about the magicians and the astrologers.
right. Okay, yes.
Okay, that's what. So now you could call them the monthly prognosticators. So astrology astrological worship in Babylon was attached to the idea that the stars, the sun and the moon and the planets all determined our destiny. And what they had to do is they had to respond to what was happening so they could control the gods so bad things wouldn't happen to them. Right? That's Babylonian worship. So they worship the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, they did make idols, but those idols were representing what they saw in the sky. And when they looked at the sky, they looked at all these constellations, and these all had meanings. These were the various types of gods. The primary gods were the ones that moved through the constellations, right? The constellations, of course, rotate, but it's the ones that move, because none of the stars move in relation to each other, except the planets. Those planets can move around. And the Bible addresses this many, many times, this type of worship. But yeah, we're maybe not all that familiar with what false worship was. We just think about the idols themselves, idols of, gold and wood and stone and so forth. But when you look at those idols are also represented in the sky, because all those different animals and different idols are the various constellations.
But in order to have made those constellations into say a lion, they would have to have seen an earthly lion first.
Yep.
Too. Okay.
Yeah. And so, we're going to continue this tomorrow, but and I want you to think about it a little bit, read over Genesis chapter 1. But one of the things we're going to see is that at the end of the reform line is the number 7. So when you get to the 7th day, that's going to be the number 7 that happens at the end of every reform line when the third angel arrives. And so here, the third angel arriving is going to be the Sabbath. And when we look at the Great Controversy reform line, we see a Sabbath at the end of it as well. That's the 7,000 years, the 7,000th of the 1,000, the 7th of the 1,000 years that happens at the end. So we can see right from the creation of the world, at least in this, and we're going to deal with it in more detail tomorrow. But we can see that the entire reform line is created. Now, I'm going to give you, and I'm going to email this to everyone. Let's see. So I got to open
We
it up.
can also see that astrological symbology in the guidons of Rome, the abominable things that they had as like the eagle and the dragon. And these were things that were carried in front of them in their order.
Okay, yeah. So they had their standards, and they had these animals on them as well. And they do represent the constellations. But there is a true understanding of these symbols that God uses, and then there is a perversion of them. Astronomy or astrology, the perversion of astronomy. We can look at the sky and we can see how stars work. In that sense, astrology is also a perversion of what God has created. Right? We can understand that concept.
Yes.
Now, so I don't know why this didn't save where I wanted it. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna have to open this up. For some reason, it doesn't open up automatically. So. I'll just show you what I'm gonna send you. And it's just gonna be a bit of a tool. I'm not happy. I read through it. There's lots of things that I would disagree with in this paper. This paper is called the Book of Reform Lines. When I was looking through to find some of these prophetic lines, I found this. and this is published in 2019. So, and in 2000, I'm not sure when in 2019 it was published, but it's Marco and Solange. So I'm not sure. It was published in Bolivia. It just says June 2019. So that's prior to the split that happened in the movement, right? Because that's going to happen in at the end of July, beginning of September. So they published it then in 2019, and it goes through the reform lines, and it's more like a children's book. And they say you can do coloring. So if you want to print it out and do coloring, you can. So it's written in a very simple fashion, but it goes through all these different reform lines, how the reform lines work, and starts with the reform lines of Noah. And so I just thought it might be a useful tool for some of you to go through to see how we have seen the reform lines, even though there's some major errors in this book. So you can maybe look at this before we go to the study tomorrow. So I'll email this out right away. Any final comments before we close with prayer? Okay. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the way that you lead in this study. And we ask, Lord, that tomorrow when we draw this line out, that you can give us insight, that we can pray about these things, and that we can fashion this line correctly. Help us as we continue this study each day, each week, and that things will become clear to each one of us. Please correct us when we're in error, that we may reveal all truth. Thank you for hearing our prayer. And we pray that you can be with each one today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.